Hello and welcome. This video will be a quick start guide to the WorkLink Create authoring platform. In it, we are going to start with a completed project in WorkLink Create. We're going to walk through the content of that project, kind of explore how it's constructed. Then we're going to dive into a blank canvas in the WorkLink Create authoring software, and we're going to author that project from scratch all the way to publish. In doing so, this should serve as an introduction to the workflow for building compelling AR content in the WorkLink platform. Let's get started. Okay, so here we are in WorkLink Create with a finished quick demo project that we're now going to walk through. So I'm going to go ahead and click this simulate button up in the top corner. We're going to cover all this again later, so don't worry if you're not following along just yet. And we're going to walk through the content that is in this particular project. So here we are on the content placement step. We can see we have this turbofan asset. And as we move forward, we have a landing page. This is for, sort of kind of an introduction. Once I hit begin, we're presented with a menu with 3 different areas of interest for this particular asset. We have an overview sequence, and then work instructions to remove the nose cone and work instructions to install the nose cone. So if we check out this overview, you can see this is a simple one-step overview that just shows the inlet, compression, and exhaust stage with some arrows showing the airflow and a bit of rotation. So again, once we jump into Create, we're going to see how to build out an overview step like this. If we use this home button to navigate back, we can then check out the remove and install sections. The remove section has a simple 3-step procedure here. First, identifying the nose cone, then finding these 6 bolts and pulling them out, and finally removing the nose cone itself. We can now either go back home to find the install section, or if we just click continue, we're going to jump straight into that install section. Now we can prepare the nose cone, install it, add those bolts back in, and finally we have a sequence complete step that would allow us to either cancel and keep working or save and exit with our progress. So this is the target for the demo that we're going to build throughout this quick start guide. If you would like to follow along, which I highly encourage, you will need a computer, access to WorkLink Create, as well as a 3-button mouse is highly useful. So let's jump over into WorkLink Create and get started on authoring this project from scratch. So here we are in WorkLink Create. This is about what it will look like after you've logged in with your username and password. You can see that quick start demo we just walked through. But I'm going to go ahead and hit this new project button right here. That'll give me an option to name my project, and we'll just call this demo-turbofan and hit confirm to start. Now that we've started, this is about what your landing page will look like in the WorkLink Create authoring platform. So you can see the platform is divided into a series of windows, and as we go through the process of building out this particular demo project, we're going to use most of the windows that you see here. Yours might look slightly different from mine. I've changed my layout a bit to move my asset library over here. Yours will probably be in the bottom corner, kind of behind where my camera is. But you can see as I click on this thing and grab it, you have the ability to move these windows around and tab them into place. So as I hover this over the central window, you can see I can tab it into the side here, or I can pull it back out and add it as an extra entry up top. So that's what I've done with my asset library. You can play around with this a little bit. You can also rescale your windows and adjust them to fit whatever screen you're working on. If, however, you change your layout so much to a place where it's either confusing or maybe you've lost a window and you're not sure where it is, there's always this window drop down up top that will allow you to click on any of them to open them. You can also go to the workspace area here and go back to the default workspace, and that'll kind of take you to that basic landing workspace that we started with. So with our windows understood and kind of laid out a little bit, let's start the process of authoring a project in WorkLink Create. So the first step in authoring is always to prepare your 3D content as well as any 2D content that you might use. In this case, we're not going to make use of anything, but if you had images, video, PDFs that you wanted to include in your project, you could have those as well. So all that content will be added to the asset library. You can see this upload files button would allow me to upload my own 3D models or, like I said, other 2D content. In this case, we're just going to search for some preloaded content that we're going to use for this particular demo. In this case, we're going to use that turbofan asset. So as I search for turbofan, you can see in my personal assets here, I have this turbofan. Yours may appear in the company assets folder as well. This is one of our pre-built default 3D models. Worth noting, personal assets are assets that you yourself have uploaded. Company assets are assets that are exposed to all the authors in your organization. You can move assets from your personal to company. So for example, when you're first getting started, if you have a collection of 3D models that you want everyone in your company to have access to, or images, logos, all that kind of stuff, you can upload them to your personal assets folder and then drag them over to company. But we're just going to go ahead and use this turbofan asset. I'm going to click on it here, and I'm then given the choice to either drag it into my step hierarchy, or if you can still see your scene view as well, you could drag it directly in there. I'm going to go ahead and drag it over to my step hierarchy. That way we have a 3D model to work with that we can use as we go through the basic overview of interacting with the platform. So you can see once I've added that turbofan asset to my step hierarchy, it also populates in my scene view here. So scene view and step hierarchy are basically the visual and list representation of all the content that's in my AR scene. So right now in here, we can see this thing, then we also have the list. If I expand the hierarchy of this particular 3D model, you'll see that the hierarchy that was associated with that model has been preserved through the import process. So the rotating parts and stationary parts are divided into different sections. There are subsections within that, and then parts within those subsections going down as far as this model supports. So if you have your own 3D resources, that structure should be preserved on import, which can be highly useful when it comes to authoring, assembly, disassembly, dividing things into subassemblies, etc. You'll also notice as I've been clicking through here that when I select something in my step hierarchy, that selection is also reflected in my scene view. And this works the other way as well. If I select something in my scene view, that selection will be reflected in my step hierarchy as well. Before we continue, I want to pause real quick and make sure we're all on the same page in terms of which step we added this particular asset to. So in order to understand why this is important, I'll note that the overall platform is divided into sequences and steps. We'll dive into this a little bit more later, but for now it's important to know that we're all working on the default state for this sequence. And I'll explain what that means in a minute, but just make sure you've added your content to the default state. It should have white icons right here. Okay, so to navigate around my scene view here, there are a few key commands that we're going to want to learn and practice. And this is where now this little display I have in the bottom corner showing my inputs should be useful. So to navigate around, we have a few commands, as I said. The first is to zoom in and out. That's rolling on the scroll wheel, or if I hold the Alt key and the right mouse button, I can also drag on the mouse to zoom in and out. So we can zoom in and out with Alt, right mouse button, or rolling on the scroll wheel. If we want to orbit around whatever we have selected, we're going to once again hold that Alt key and then use the left mouse button. So Alt, left mouse button will let me orbit whatever I have selected, or what my camera is centered on. Additionally, we can strafe or pan side to side with the center mouse button. So if I hold down the center mouse button and then drag, that allows me to kind of strafe side to side. Couple more, we also have the ability to look around from a stationary point of view. This is just that right mouse button with no Alt key. So we can zoom, look around. Last one, if we keep holding that right mouse button and then we use our W, A, S, and D keys, we can now sort of move around as if we're in a video game. So we can walk forward, walk backward. We can also use up and down as E and Q. So you have a lot of flexibility here in terms of how you want to position your camera view. You'll notice as I author that I'm almost always holding this Alt key and orbiting around. This becomes particularly useful because as you start animating and moving things in your 3D scene, you always want to have a sense of where things are actually positioned relative to each other, i.e. it can be very easy to get yourself into a place where from a particular perspective, it looks like two things are lined up, but as you orbit around it, you'll see they're not actually touching. So you'll notice me kind of always doing this orbit, and I would encourage you to get into that habit as well as you begin your authoring journey. A few more commands to help with navigating around the scene view. I mentioned that this orbit is based on whatever you have selected. So if I select something particular here, I can focus my camera onto whatever I have selected using this target icon in the top corner, or the F key. So if I hit that target right now, we'll see I've focused in on this thing, and now my orbit is centered on that. So navigating around as we're working in different areas of a particular project, it can be quite useful to select different parts, press F to focus in on them, and then be able to orbit around there. That can support navigation and just giving yourself a cleaner, more easy way to view whatever it is you're working on. A few of the other ones we have here, this home button will always take you to the position of your interactive mode camera. We'll explain that more later, but for now, just understand this home button will kind of take you to a default home perspective. We also have a view cube up here. This is again connected to whatever you have selected, but just allows you to kind of toggle front, right, top, and bottom views of your asset. Can be useful again for navigation, especially if you're kind of getting a little bit lost. Finally, we have the ability to toggle between orthographic and perspective views. Okay, so that gives us a brief overview of how to navigate in the scene view. Again, if you're following along, I would encourage you to maybe pause the video for a moment and practice with those commands. Make sure you get comfortable navigating and doing all of those different types of motion, because it will be quite useful as we begin the process of authoring and animating. Okay, from there, we can now dive into beginning the authoring process for building out that demo project. So as I said, we already added our content to the default state here, and now we can go ahead and explain in a little bit more detail about the layout of our project. So AR projects in WorkLink Create are always divided into sequences and steps. So the metaphor that I tend to use when explaining this is it's like chapters of a book and then pages within that chapter. So if your overall book is going to be this overview, we're going to have a chapter or maybe a table of contents that'll be our main menu. Then we're going to have an overview chapter, an install the nose cone chapter, and a remove the nose cone chapter. And then within that, we'll have steps that'll be the pages within those chapters that will show those particular steps. To switch metaphors here, I mentioned before this default state. This is a little bit more akin to the stage on which your play is going to happen. So you can imagine if you were putting on a play and you had a stage, you would add some props to the stage at the start of the play, and they would exist throughout all of the steps in that, throughout all of the acts in that play. And if you made changes to those props, those changes would propagate across all those steps. So you can see right now we have this default state that's populated here, and if I jump over to step 1, you can see that this content is all already here. And as I keep adding a few more steps real quick, we're going to remove these, but just for the purposes of a demo, you can see that content stays here. Now, if I go to my default state and I make an adjustment to this thing, let's say I realize, oh, this nose cone was actually out of position and it needed to be over here. We're going to see that that adjustment has populated across all of these steps. So again, like that prop that we set up at the beginning of the play, when we change its position, that position is changed across all the steps. However, if on one of these steps I had already changed this thing's position, let's say I move it back here, and then I come back to the default state and I move this thing somewhere else. That change is going to propagate across the steps where it wasn't changed, but it's not going to affect the step where it was changed. So you never risk overwriting work that you've previously done. Finally, if you have a part that is not in the default state, it does not obey any of these rules. So another tool that we have that we'll make use of a little bit more later in this platform is the ability to create some primitives. That comes from this create dropdown right here. So if I create a primitive cube on this step, you'll see it gets a different icon color here. So this icon is red, and that's telling me, hey, this cube asset that you just made, this only exists on this step. So it doesn't exist on any other steps. It doesn't exist in the default state. And if I move it around, it'll only affect the instance on this step. So even if I were to continue from there, it'll only affect this instance. So that's a brief overview of default states. I'm going to go ahead and really quickly just use my undo button up here. That could also be Control Z and undo all the way back to where we just had this one content here on the default state. Might take a second. It's a lot of clicks. We're going to get rid of our steps here, but there we go. And again, as you would expect, that undo command is supported everywhere throughout the platform, so always feel free to just make use of that if you want to experiment and then jump back to wherever you want to be authoring from. So it's important that we had our content added to the default state, one, because it allows us to do that rapid updating, 2, because it also supports more efficiency with memory. Again, as you load into this project and you're on these particular sequences, the system only loads the content once per sequence, and then on each subsequent step, just loads the differences between that existing content and the content on that particular step. But with this all set up now, we're ready to begin the process of authoring. So authoring takes place in 2 main phases. The first phase is the UI element of it. So that's that 2-dimensional on-screen UI, the next and back buttons, the home menu that we saw, all those kind of things. The second stage is the 3D content. So that's either the callouts or animations that we saw before, any kind of highlights or things that we want to do to communicate to our user what they're meant to be doing on a given step. The platform is quite flexible in that it supports kind of authoring those 2 elements in any way you want. You could build out all your animations and then go back in and build out all the UI. You could build out all the UI and then go back in and do all your animations. Really, whatever is most comfortable as a workflow for you or makes sense for the way that you want to build content. So we'll do our best to kind of show both workflows as we go through this process. You also notice here that autosave just passed. By default, that's set for every 10 minutes, just to ensure that content is regularly getting saved. You never risk losing any work if your computer shuts down or something like that. So to get started, I'm going to start by authoring the UI for those introductory main menu steps that we had, and then we'll go through and build out some other stuff. So to author the UI, we can jump into the UI editor here, and we're again on step 1 of sequence 1. And if we remember back to that demo that we saw at the beginning, that first step was using this intro title element. So in the UI editor, all I have to do to select a particular template is double click on it. And as you saw before, as you've seen, Create is preloaded with a number of basic templates. Now, the UI editor is designed to be highly flexible in that I could take any of those templates and modify them to my desire and save that as my own custom templates. You could also build them up from scratch using these building blocks down here. That's beyond the scope of this demo, but we do have video content that supports that workflow. So for the purpose of today, we're just going to kind of start with an existing template, make a few changes, and then save that as our own custom template. And we'll do that a couple of times because we're going to want a intro template, a menu, and then a few content templates as well. So to edit this, I can just go in, double click on an element, and type in what I want. So in this case, this is our demo/turbofan. We don't need a description for today, but maybe we'll just say, remove nose cone, because that's what we're going to be doing. And we have our begin button here. I can also click over to this image, and as I have this selected, you'll see I have this layout controls here and different variations for things like that. So in this case, I can just click where this image placeholder is to choose one of my existing ones. We're just going to use another image that should be preloaded, in this case, this scope marker. This is an image marker if you're curious where this image comes from. But once I select that, you can see that image populates in there. We also have some controls for changing colors and things like that. So if I selected this area here, I could come over here and adjust its style and maybe start playing around with colors or things like that. If you're interested in learning more about the UI, again, we have a lot more content that supports it, or you can pause this video and kind of play around a little bit. But for now, we're just going to leave it at this. The last thing we're going to need to do is we have this begin button. And when I select it, we can see down the bottom there are actions. And this action is telling the system, what do I want to happen when the user clicks on this button? Because we don't have any steps for this to go to yet, we're going to kind of leave this blank, but just noting it because we're going to come back in a moment and set up all of these connections. So we have our sort of introductory step here. And then the next step we want to build is a menu that's going to allow our user to navigate to the different sequences that we're going to build out for them. So I can go back up here and just click this plus button. This is going to continue from where we left off. So now we have a second step here that we can play with. And we're going to change to a branch template. So this template will let us just have a bunch of buttons that we can then play around with. In this case, there are 15. If I navigate over here, I can see the hierarchy. Similar to the step hierarchy here, we have a page hierarchy, and we can see all these buttons. So now I'm just going to use this eye icon here, which will let me hide things that I don't want to see. And I'm going to hide all of these except 3, because we only need 3 for the demo that we're building today. But again, you can imagine as you build out a bunch of content, you might end up using all of these buttons. So our first button is going to be that overview. Our next button is going to take us to a remove nose cone. And our third button is going to take us to install nose cone. Oops. All right, now that we have these three buttons prepared, we want to wire up those connections as we mentioned before. I might also change this title to demo or whatever else we want it to be. And then we can begin building out these three distinct sequences. So first thing I'm going to do is go back to this step and make sure this begin button is going to take me to step 2. So again, with these actions, I can either choose any step anywhere in the project for it to go to, or in this case, I'm just going to say next step because this is the second step after this. So once I hit begin, it's just going to push me over here. We could adjust these right now, but we don't have anywhere for them to go yet. So instead, I'm just going to make sure this home button is set up. And I'm going to say that that does a move to step command, and that goes to my sequence 1, step 1, which I can pick from here. So now when a user clicks on the home button, it's going to take us to sequence 1, step 1, which will be that. So let's say we built this out and we said, you know what, I think this menu right here is perfect. I want to be able to reuse this everywhere else in this project. And in fact, I want to be able to reuse this in other projects going forward. Well, we know that we chose it from a sort of basic template. But if I use this action dropdown up here, I can either save this as a new template, which will then sort of leave me that basic branch template before, and then I could give this one a new custom name, or I could apply changes to the branch template so that every time I select the branch template, it looks like this for this project. I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And now if I go over to a new sequence here and we see that branch template, we can see it looks exactly like that. So you have the ability to save these templates however you want. With that being said, the final piece we can do before we start authoring everywhere else is to give ourselves a little bit of organization. So I'm going to go ahead to the sequence 1 and I'm going to rename this to menu. This just can help me keep track of, okay, this sequence is my menu sequence. This first step, I'm going to double click into this. This is my introduction. And then step 2, this is my kind of top menu. So again, just renaming these things so that I can keep track of them. And when we go back to select the actions and we want to move to step, and we're going to look through the sequence, we can see these sequences in here named, and it's easy to know where we want to go. With that established, we can now start working on these three sequences. So we're going to start out with this overview sequence. So I'm going to go over to sequence 2. I'm going to just go ahead and preemptively rename this overview because that's what this is going to be. And we're only going to need one step here, so I'll just leave that as step 1. Now, because the overview is going to be mostly focused on the 3D content, we don't really need much UI content. So I can just select this blank template here, and we're going to use that. And we're actually not even going to need these next and back buttons because we're only going to be navigating back to the home screen. So I could just hide this entire next and back button assembly here, click on my home button, really quickly set this up to move to my main menu step. And that way my navigation is set up and my user always has the ability to go back to the main menu no matter where they are. I would say that's in general a best practice. With our UI setup, we can now turn our attention to building out the 3D content. So we're going to return to those navigation things that we had before, and we're going to start working on our 3D content here. In order to do that, we need to learn how to manipulate 3D content. So real quickly, I'm just going to create another cube that we can play with so we can learn about these gizmos that you saw me use very briefly before. So with this cube selected, we have this list of gizmos up here. And as I hover over each of these 4 buttons, we're going to see a little quick tooltip pop out. These tooltips are present throughout all of Create and can be highly useful as you're first learning the product to give you some information about what all these buttons do. So as I hover over pretty much anything around here, it should give me a tooltip call out that will show me kind of what do these buttons do, et cetera, et cetera. So with the gizmos in mind, I can hover over this first one. We can see that this is the translate gizmo. These tooltips will also call out the shortcut keys. So we can see the shortcut key for this is W. There's also a rotate whose shortcut key is E. So as I start pressing E and W back and forth, you can see we're switching between those gizmos. Again, best practice, I would say, as you're first learning the project, to get used to using these hotkeys because they can be quite useful in making your authoring workflow faster. So how does this translate gizmo work? Well, I have this cube selected. We can zoom in on it. And you can see as I hover over each of these axes, I have the ability to move the object in that target axis. So if I click on this one, no matter what I do with my mouse, it's always going to slide along the z-axis, similar with x and y. In between the axes, we also have these planes. So I can select the y and z plane and just move it in that plane, but it won't move in the x. With this gizmo, you do also have the option to select directly in the middle. This will then move the part perpendicular to the plane of the scene view camera. To be honest, I would never use this. Don't click in the middle here. It's pretty much never useful. And honestly, it's just more likely to land you in a place where the cube is sort of like in some odd, strange location. So as you're getting started, and even me as an experienced author, I pretty much only move this in one direction at a time. And as I mentioned before, I'll constantly be orbiting as well to kind of see where is this thing actually positioned and adjust it from there. Maybe every once in a while I'd move in two directions at a time, but even then, just kind of stick to one direction. You'll also notice as I've selected this that there's an object properties window on the side here. This window is controlling the properties of the object I have selected, and you'll notice that these transforms are changing as I'm moving these things in these axes. So we'll end up using that a bit more later, but for now, just wanted to note that this is the object properties for this particular cube. Okay, switching over to my rotation gizmo, again, I can click here, or I can use my shortcut key E. I can rotate this cube. This behaves again pretty much exactly how you'd expect, and very similar to the translate gizmo. I can rotate in any axis at a time. There's also this sort of similar interface to the translate gizmo in that you can rotate perpendicular to the axis you have selected. Again, I would pretty much never do that. The one trick I would use quite often with the rotate gizmo is holding control. This trick is supported across all three, but I'd say it's most useful in the rotate gizmo. By holding control, you're activating the snap settings. You also see there's a snap settings drop down here. And the snap settings basically cause this thing to snap to particular positions. So in this case, the snap is set to every 15 degrees. So instead of just free rotating this thing anywhere I want, I can snap this thing to 15-degree increments. So this can be quite useful if you want to guarantee an exact 90-degree angle, an exact 45-degree angle, et cetera, you can do so by using those snap settings. Final gizmo we can play with is scale. We're not going to use that much in this demo, but worth noting that it's here as well. Again, we can scale in a single axis at a time. We can scale in any two axes at a time, or much more common to use this with scale because we want to preserve the ratio is to grab this cube at the end of any one of these axes, and it will scale in all three at the same time. You'll also note if you're an author who prefers to type commands into the transform window here. So for example, I could go in and zero out my rotations like this. I could zero out my positions to guarantee this thing is at the center, and fix my scales all to 1. By default, the scale aspect ratio is locked. So this toggle locks the aspect ratio. So you can see as I type 2 into here, it's going to automatically adjust the other two scales to compensate to keep this thing's aspect ratio the same. You can always toggle that off if I want to reset this thing to have a different aspect ratio and then toggle it back on. And that way I'll guarantee I have my cube preserved exactly as it was. Okay, now that we've learned about our gizmos here, we're ready to start building out our overview step. So I'm going to get rid of this cube here. I can just hit the delete key and begin authoring our overview. So if we think back to that, we'll remember that there were a few key elements. There were callouts, sort of floating tags showing the inlet, compression, and exhaust stages. We also had arrows on the beginning and end showing the airflow direction. And finally, we had all of the rotating parts sort of continuously rotating. I'm just going to go ahead and hit confirm on that autosave here to make sure it stays out of our way. So I'm going to begin by making the rotating parts continuously rotate. That'll give us an opportunity to start talking about animations. Then we'll go in and add that other content as well. So if I start selecting in here, I can now see in my step hierarchy, there's a category for all rotating parts, and I can select that all at once and then be ready to animate with it. So we know we're going to want it to rotate, so I'm going to pre-select my rotation gizmo. And now we're going to turn our attention to the timeline editor down at the bottom here. So the timeline editor is the home for all of our animations. There are several ways to add animations to it. However, I think the easiest is to hit this record button. The record button works similar to keyframing in other applications if you're familiar with animation. So once I hit record, I've added a keyframe. This is noting the starting position of all of the content in my scene. I can then do actions, for example, rotate this thing. And then once I stop recording, that's recording another keyframe at the ending position. So why am I mentioning keyframes and why is this an important structure to understand? Well, because when you're recording, it's only tracking the starting and ending position of all the content in your scene, not whatever's happened in between. So for example, if I were to rotate this around again and then rotate it back and stop recording, if I play that second rotation here, we're going to see it barely moves at all because it only measures where it started and ended and then extrapolates the animation in between. Get rid of this here by deleting this time bar. But this first rotation where we just rotated in one direction, we're going to see that we started and ended in a different place, so it extrapolated a rotation in between that. So with that being said, let's talk about what we've created here. So we can see the rotating parts have been added as an object with these sort of like rows attached to it. You can see the timeline is currently spanned over 10 seconds. At the end of these 10 seconds, there's this blue line right here. This blue line is the repeat line. So if I were to hit this play button here, this red line is indicating where we are in the timeline, and we let these 10 seconds elapse. As soon as the red line hits that blue line, it's just going to restart and play the animation over again. So by default in the platform, animations are always repeated. However, you can move where this repeat line is. So I could drag it back to repeat every 3 seconds or something like that. And then similarly, I could drag my rotation out to take up this full time. So I'm adjusting how long this rotation happens for. And then if I click play, we'll see that's going to rotate and it's going to keep rotating. Then it hits that repeat line. It's going to start over. However, we can do more fine controls on this. So if I double click on this time bar rotate element, I get sort of properties associated with it. So I can see the easing, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, the start and end time, and then the angle and axis. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust this angle a little bit. We're going to want more angle because I want this to rotate a little bit faster. So let's change this angle to 180 degrees. And then when I click this, it's going to spin and then hit that repeat line and continue. So if I wanted to get really particular, I could maybe change this repeat line to 6 seconds. You'll note that right now I've been doing it by dragging. I can also change it with a single right click. Left click will move my red bar, right click will move my blue bar. And I could extend this all the way to that time and make it 360 degrees, whoops, 360. And then over 6 seconds, we're going to get a full 360 degree rotation and then repeat. And so that should create a nice continuous motion on that nose cone there. Okay, so now we have our first basic animation, but if we remember back to the overview, we had quite a bit of other content here. So the next piece of content we want to add is those arrows kind of showing the inlet and outlet. So to grab those arrows, we're going to go back to the asset library. We're going to search for these default arrows. Again, these are an included piece of content you should have anywhere. You can see we have a long list of them. In this case, I'm just going to use an arrow medium. Again, I can drag it from my step hierarchy, sorry, from my asset library into my step hierarchy. And you'll see because I did that on step 1, this got a little red icon next to it, marking that it is not in the default state. For this case, it doesn't really matter because it's only one step. Now I'm going to use my snap settings on the rotation to make sure that this is rotated at exactly 90 degrees. We're going to turn it at a 45-degree angle, so it's kind of pointing in general in the same direction as this. And then we'll use our position gizmo, one axis at a time, to move this thing into position, kind of pointing directly down the middle of my turbofan. So I have this arrow pointing pretty much down the middle and set up to be animated. So I can grab my arrow, hit this record button again, pull it into where I want it to go, stop recording, and I end up with this translate time bar that kind of moves it that way. So I can double click on this time bar, and now we're going to play around with this easing command a little bit. This is maybe a nice to have, not a need to have, but I do think it looks a lot better. So if I play this right now, you can see this has this really rigid kind of motion. That's because by default, the motion is linear, so it's perfectly still, and then it moves at exactly the same speed, the distance we told it to move, and then it's perfectly still again. If I change this easing to ease in and out, it's going to kind of ramp up and down that motion, and it's just going to look a lot more natural. So you can see it kind of ramps up and then stops, which is a much more natural way for something to move. So now that I have that, I can extend it a little bit. So maybe it's going to move a little bit slower. And we want this to happen right about in the middle of my animation here. But we don't want this arrow to be visible the whole time. So now we're going to play around with adding some animations to kind of make it appear and disappear. To do that, I'm going to add a new channel. So you can see we have each of these animation time bars exists on a channel. You can have multiple time bars on a single channel. This is mostly useful for more visual clarity for the author as to exactly what's going on. And I can add new time bars to this channel either by clicking this plus time bar button right here, or by right-clicking in the channel itself and then selecting from the available time bars. There are a lot of them here. We won't use all of them in this demo. In this case, I'm just going to choose the fade object in and out one and shorten this to about half length. So now if I deselect this arrow, you can see that arrow is going to fade in and then move. I can now take this and right-click on the time bar, duplicate it, and now I get a second one and move it to the end. Double click on that to open up the properties, and then change from a fade in to a fade out. And by doing that whole series here, we can now see we get an arrow that fades in, points in the direction of airflow, and then fades out. So let's say, you know what, I'm really happy with that and I want to reuse it. So I have this arrow in front and I want to make another arrow in back. Well, I can right-click on the arrow to duplicate it. That's easy enough. Drag it over to the back here. But also with this entire set of time bars here, this entire object, I can right-click on this whole thing and duplicate it. And now I get another one. You can see right now it says missing reference here. That's because it's not assigned to a particular object. But with my new arrow selected, I can right-click on this thing and say replace with selected. And now that animation is assigned to my other arrow. So now if I go back and play this whole thing, we're going to see we get both of those arrows doing that motion. And once we hit the repeat line, that's just going to repeat again. So quick way to sort of build out a bunch of content here. Okay, so that is basic introduction to building out some animations. Again, as we go through and author the next phases, we're going to use that a little bit more, although I will start to go a little bit faster with building out some of that content. The final piece for this overview is those callouts for the inlet, compression, and exhaust stages of our turbofan. To build these, there's a couple ways we could do it. I'm going to show you arguably the easiest and most flexible way, and that is by creating what's called an empty object. So if I create this empty object here, an empty object is basically just a point in space that we can assign some properties to. So you can see it's just a point, it's got no 3D geometry, and I can position it wherever I want. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and position this point where I know I want that callout to be. Maybe we'll start in the middle here for this compression stage callout. So let's say I know I want that callout to attach to the compression stage here. With this empty object, I can just toggle on and enable callouts on it. You can see this thing is going to pop up right here. So this is what we call a callout. It's kind of a floating label. By default, it always points to wherever your user's camera is, or basically always points towards the user. It has a long list of properties. We're not going to adjust all of them, but we will play around with a few. This first one is the title, and we could change this to compression because that's what we want to show. The description we don't need, so we're going to toggle that off, although we could use it if we wanted to. And finally, we're going to adjust some of the color properties. So I think this tends to look better if the text is white and the background is kind of orange. And then we can go to the line. This is the line connecting it down here. Change that to orange as well. And then we end up with a nice floating orange callout here. Now, I do think it's floating a little too high. That's controlled by the offset. I can either type in a different value here, so we could try 0.15 and say, that looks pretty good. Alternatively, I could click on this icon, and then it'll give me a dashed gizmo that just controls the position of the callout without affecting the position of the empty object it's attached to. I'm going to leave that be, but just worth noting that that is available to you. Now that I have one callout for this compression stage, we can just go ahead and duplicate this empty object and very quickly make the other two. So I'm going to duplicate it, move one over here, change this to inlet, and pull that trick one more time, duplicate it, move it over here, and change this to exhaust. Now that I have the three of them, I'm going to say, what, maybe they look a little bit small. So I'm going to Control select all of them and go into the scale factor and change it from 1 to 2. So now we have nice big readable callouts for those inlet, compression, and exhaust stages. And with that, we now have a functioning overview step. Just let this play through here to confirm this looks exactly how I want. Got my rotating parts, some animations, and clear callouts. Okay, so if we're happy with that, we're then able to move on to authoring the removal and installation of the nose cone assembly. So to do that, we're going to make another new sequence. Hit this plus button here. When I do so, you'll note that this new sequence has a default state associated with it. It's worth noting that the default states are unique to each sequence. So if I change the default state on the menu sequence, for example, it will not affect the overview or this new sequence that we're going to call remove nose cone. Each default state is unique to the sequence that it's on. And when I'm hitting this plus button, it's just copying the default state from the previous sequence that I made. But we don't really need to worry about that because we're happy with the default states being the same across all of the projects. And with this new sequence made, we can now return to the process of authoring a basic assembly, or in this case, disassembly workflow. So as I mentioned before, there are kind of two paths you could take when doing this. You could either build out all the UI first and then add in all the animations afterwards. You could add all the animations first and then build out the UI afterwards, or you kind of do both at the same time as you go through. And I'll kind of show some of the commands that'll let you do each of those. So let's start by building out the first animation. In this case, we need to think about our user, and we need to remember that as we're authoring for an AR project, we do need to think about directing our user's attention. Again, you can imagine they're going to be holding an iPad or wearing a headset, and they're going to be able to look anywhere they want to as they're doing that. So we want to provide them some information to say, hey, this is where you need to be looking right now. And we need to kind of be aware of that as we author through the project. So when we go to this first step of any new sequence, I tend to always add in a step that's basically like, hey, look here, this is where you're going to be working for the next little while. So in this case, they're going to be working on the nose cone. So I want to do something to draw their attention over to this nose cone. You can see when I have this nose cone part selected, whether it be the entire cone or this part that represents the nose cone itself, the gizmo is over here. That's a common thing that'll come with 3D models, especially in the aerospace world, where all of the parts have their center point set to the same location. We do have the ability to adjust this though, and we are going to, we'll see why in a moment. So with this cone element selected, I can click the move without affecting children. This is because this cone element is an empty object, and I can move that over so that it's right on the center of the 3D geometry. If instead I had a 3D part, in this case the part that represents the cone, I can also adjust its pivot point. In this case, you go over the object properties and use the pivot area, and then I can either adjust it manually just like I did before, or I can choose to move it to the center. So in this case, I'm going to do that, so now we can confirm that both the pivot point of this part and the pivot point of the cone are set sort of in the center of this thing. So now we can turn our attention to building out that animation to direct our user's attention. To do so, instead of recording anything, I'm just going to take the part that I have selected and add it to the timeline. So that's going to give me a little channel here that I can now add some animations to. So I'm going to use my right click and start adding some animations. The first one is a set object color animation. We'll double click on this and choose a blue color right off the bat, and then we'll look at what this looks like. So this just flashes this thing blue. Again, if our user isn't looking straight at that, that's not really going to do very much, and we'll just move our repeat lines. This repeats a lot sooner. But if we get our user over to this area, then when this flashes blue, it'll be more clear exactly what they need to be focused on. So now we need to think about, okay, how do we get our user over to this area? Well, we can add another channel, and we're going to add something called a highlight sphere. I'm also going to use that blue color, and we're going to change the scale of this to maybe 0.5 for now. And now if I play this, we can see what that looks like. So that highlight sphere sort of penetrates everything, regardless of where you are. And there's like a nice sonar ping of like, hey, this is where you need to be working. So you can imagine as my user's looking around, they're going to see this ping and go, okay, hey, I need to look at this. And then once they get close enough, they'll see the object itself changing color, and that will provide the necessary information for them to know where they need to be focused. So with that animation built up, we can now turn our attention to adding the requisite UI to support that. To do so, I'm going to select this content template here. And again, want to make a few quick changes first that we're then going to save to this template because we want to reuse it throughout our entire project. I want to make sure that this home button does in fact navigate to my home menu. So we can take this, make sure it goes to the stop menu. We're also going to then have a quick look up here at what this header is doing. So within the UI, we have the support for variables. So right now you can see this looks like a bunch of gobbledygook that says step, and there's this hashtag element. So these hashtag elements are step variables. In this case, the first one is saying step number, the second one is saying step total, and then there's step name supported as well. So looking at it in the template, these variables are going to be blank. But if I hop over to my scene view, you can see they've populated. And you can see what this is saying is we're on the first step of 1 total steps in my sequence, and the name of that step is step 1. So we're actually going to leave this for now, but we can go ahead and change this to, nose cone or something like that. And then we should see that populate in a moment. It might take it a few seconds to reload here. There you go. And so we can see step 1 of 1 is nose cone, and we have our animations here. Finally, in the UI, we can change our description text. We're just going to tell the user to identify a nose cone. And, oops, I have a period at the end of that. Here. Sorry. And that will serve as our content template for this following sequence. So now we have our first step. If I hit the plus button, it's just going to continue from that step. So we're going to keep the same template exactly as we made it. All the changes that we made are going to be preserved. So in this case, we can just do that and sort of go ahead and keep authoring. Alternatively, we could also save these changes to the source template or a new template if we knew we wanted to use that a lot. So now we want to turn our attention to actually animating. In this case, we've gotten our user to identify the nose cone. So now to remove it, they're going to need to remove these 6 bolts. I can go in and select one of those bolts and then say, okay, there's an empty object that holds all 6 of them. That makes my life really easy. The center of this empty object is over here, and I might once again use this trick to move it to the middle. And then we can do a basic animation to show the removal of these bolts. So first, I'm going to hit record and move the bolts out. Stop recording, and there we go. Now we have our basic translate animation that has the bolts removed. We can extend that to maybe take a second and a half and adjust the easing as we did before, just so that it looks a little bit smoother. But once again, we do want to add some context for our user and some sort of highlight spheres, color changes to help them understand what they should be doing and where they should be focusing. So I'm going to add another channel here, and we're basically just going to go through and do the same thing. I'm going to have a set object color. In this case, I'm going to choose orange for both of these elements. The reason I'm doing that is it's quite useful when you're authoring in augmented reality and in general in instruction making to develop a visual language with your user so that they can really quickly understand what's meant to be going on any step. So in this case, I'm going to establish a visual language early on that says anytime something flashes orange, that means it's being removed. Anytime something flashes blue, that means you need to pay attention to it. And anytime something flashes green, that means it's being installed. So for now, since we're doing a removal, we're going to have everything flashing orange. Finally, we're going to have these fade out at the end so that they disappear. And then once we turn around and do the installation steps, we're going to see this switch to using green. So now we can check out what that animation looks like. The bolts are removed and then fade out. Finally, I can adjust my UI to say remove bolts and done. All right, maybe adjust the name here to remove bolts as well. Need one more step. That's removing the nose cone itself. And I'm going to make this much easier on myself. So I already have a really nice animation here of something being removed. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this entire thing, paste it over here, reassign it to this new part. And now we're going to have an animation already queued to remove this nose cone. The other thing I want to note is we've been using this continue step button. And so you can see on this step, the bolts were here. And then at the end of this step, they were removed and transparent. So when we hit continue step, it picked up where we left off. So those bolts are already removed. And now we can check out this trick that we did and see, okay, hey, that's done as well. So now this nose cone gets removed. And I want to pause for a quick moment here and pay some attention to that thread I started earlier about different authoring workflows. So let's say you wanted to just keep building out these animations without having to go back and edit the UI and kind of swap back and forth. I can just hit the plus button again right here, and we can just keep going and then edit the UI later. So I could, let's say this is going to be my final step here. You can just keep hitting plus and animating and then go back and edit the UI all at once. So I can change this name to remove nose cone, or maybe just remove cone. Go back and edit my UI as well. Just swap out a few words here. And finally, this will be my sort of complete step. And we can change from a content template, or we can just keep it here and say removal complete. Oops. And then say use right arrow. Oops, sorry, can't type today. Oh my goodness. To continue to installation. So basically, we're giving our user some direction. They did a good job. They removed this. If they click the next button, we want them to continue to the installation step. So let's talk about how we would do that. So one option is we could just hit this plus button and we could build out another sequence that shows the installation of the nose cone. However, there is a much faster way to do it. And this takes advantage of a command Crate has called reverse sequence. Basically, what it lets you do is if you build out an entire sequence, you can click one button and then get the inverse of that sequence. So it will reverse the order of all the steps and reverse all the animations. So you can imagine if we take this and we duplicate this sequence, and then we hit this reverse sequence button, we now are going to have a sequence that starts where we ended, and then all the animations are going to be backwards, showing the installation of all these parts. So in this case, now we have the installation of the nose cone, followed by the installation of the bolts, followed by identifying nose cone if we wanted to. So this is 95% of the way to installing the nose cone. So I can go ahead and say install nose cone, and then make our last few adjustments to support that. So we're going to take this complete, and instead we want to again provide our user some reference. So I'm actually going to go and find this nose cone element here, and sometimes the easiest way to find something is just to select it somewhere else, and that selection will be preserved across steps. You could also navigate your way to this part in the step hierarchy. And if we go to the object properties, we can now see that its status is hidden. That's because it was hidden at the end of the last sequence. We can change the status just by using these arrows to return it to the default state, or using the drop downs here. With that status changed, it's now visible, and we can begin authoring with it. So we're just going to add a quick animation to draw attention to it. In this case, I'm actually just going to copy the one that I had from here and paste it right here. And now we get an animation to prepare the nose cone. Change our text here to say prepare the nose cone. And I'm going to start going even faster here because most of this is going to be repetition from stuff that we've already done. Go over here, and now it's hidden again. And we have this fade object in and out command. So honestly, the easiest way to correct that is just to delete this. And we're going to adjust all these time bars a little bit to be more forward. Maybe we're actually going to switch out and have the highlight sphere happen at the end. Finally, remembering our visual language, we're going to switch this to green. And now we have an animation that says, hey, take this nose cone, install it. And once it's installed, you get a nice green flash that says, hey, you did that correctly. Again, update our text to install cone, both here and up here. These are, sort of nice to haves. This would be, intro or whatever else. Go ahead and adjust these as well real quick, just to say install bolts. And similarly down here, make all of the same changes and do our same switcheroo with the highlight spheres. So as I'm going through this, you're sort of starting to see what this workflow can look like. Again, the goal of this platform is these kind of updates are coming pretty fast. So, we've been at this maybe an hour now. Again, these are pretty, there's been a lot of sort of discussion around introduction, but regardless, we're going to end up with a completed project in under an hour, which should be pretty fast for authoring out AR content. Okay, now we have our steps that support the introduction, installing the nose cone, and installing the bolts. And we want this last step here that's going to be the kind of procedure complete step. So I'm going to choose this exit scenario template. We can edit it to say that, install complete, exit scenario, and adjust these button actions to make sure they do what we want them to do. In this case, this one is set to finish procedure. That will save all my progress and close out of the particular session. Or cancel will let me go back to the previous step. So with that done, we now need to do the final pieces of a project. These are sort of the dressing, making sure all of the wires are connected properly to navigate my user where they want to go, and setting up the interactive mode camera. So we're going to go back to my menu first, and we're going to make sure that all three of these buttons go where we want them to go. So we're going to click on the overview, have that go to step 1 of the overview sequence. Remove nose cone will go to step 1 of the remove nose cone sequence. And install nose cone will go to step 1 of the install sequence. Similarly, we want to check that the end of the remove nose cone sequence automatically takes us into the beginning of the install nose cone sequence. In order to do that, we're going to use a new window. That window is called the sequence editor. And this is sort of the visual representation of the user flow through a project. So we can see a visual representation of our 3 sequences here. We can toggle on and off different connections that might be available to us. And what we want to do is connect the end of the remove nose cone sequence to the beginning of the install sequence. And what we're saying here is basically when the user clicks the next arrow at the end of this sequence, where does it take them? So what step does it take them to? So in this case, we're saying the end of the remove nose cone sequence, when they click the next arrow, that should take them to the beginning of the install nose cone sequence. And this allows you, if you're building out a much more complicated project, to string together a series of sequences into one solid continuous flow, so the user doesn't have to bounce around back and forth between some kind of main menu or something else. So with that set up, we can close out of that. And the final piece we're going to want to do, I mentioned, is the interactive mode cameras. So if you've played around in our application a little bit, you'll know that there are a few different ways to view the content. You can use the AR views where you're either overlaid on your, in this case, turbofan asset, or you're placing it on a flat surface. But as in Create, there is support for sort of a 3D viewer style experience. And in that 3D viewer style experience, there's something called the interactive mode camera, and this controls the view that you have as you simulate your project. So you can see right now this interactive mode camera is in the same place on every single one of these steps. And if I were to hit my simulate button, just like we did before, to begin testing my project, we're going to see that my view is always kind of set to this interactive mode camera's position. Now, of course, I can use the same commands in here as I did before to adjust that, but as I go back to home, it's always going to bring me back to the position of that camera. So I want to change the position of that camera to have a better view of everything that's going on. And that is a change that we can do in the default state. So if I go to the default state and select this interactive mode camera, I can, maybe position myself to about here. And then we're going to use a trick where with the camera selected in its object properties, we'll see these two toggles available here. One of these toggles will move my view to where the camera is, if I want to sort of check what it's seeing, or if I don't want to look at this camera preview available here. The other toggle will move the camera to where I am. This one is the most useful one because I can just click this, and now that camera is pointing here on the default state for the menu sequence. So now if I simulate this menu sequence, you can see it's going to point like that. And as I hit begin, we get this sort of overview with it in the background there. Now again, because the default states are not connected across sequences, we do have to make this change everywhere. We could, if we wanted to, just copy the transforms from this interactive mode camera to these other sequences. So I can right click here and copy all the properties of its position, go to the overview sequence, click on it, and paste those properties. And now it will point there for the overview sequence as well. For the remove and install nose cone, though, I think I want it to probably point more towards the nose of this part. So I'm going to position my camera, approximately there. Click on the interactive mode camera and choose that position on the default state. Again, you could do this on a step-by-step basis. So for example, if I were in here and I had this introductory step, and then I wanted to zoom in a little bit more on the point where we're actually installing the nose cone, I can go and make that change on these steps here and have sort of a more zoomed in view. So with that interactive mode camera set up, we should be pretty much ready to go ahead and publish this project. However, before we do want to test it all the way through. So again, we're going to once again use that simulate function, and we're going to go ahead and click through and make sure that all the buttons work. So we want to check this home button, takes us where we want, that the overview goes to the overview step, that this remove nose cone goes through and shows us our 3 steps exactly how we want them to be shown, and that these home buttons work, the install nose cone works, and potentially even that the remove nose cone to install nose cone jump works. But once we've confirmed that, that is a completed first project in WorkLink Create that we've authored together. So I'm going to stop simulating. I'm going to go ahead and hit publish. There are a few publishing settings here. We have detailed descriptions of what all these do. In this case, we'll just select demo, and we're going to hit publish right now. And immediately this is going to be published as this sort of spins and waits for under a minute, I would expect. It should then be made available to view on the end user application. There we go, published successfully. So I would encourage you at this time to go ahead and take a moment to open up the end user application on an iPhone, iPad, headset, whatever you have handy, and view your first completed project in WorkLink Create. Once you've done that, there are a few other tools I want to highlight that are available in the platform for continued learning. The first is we have an AI companion over here. So we have this Getting Started with WorkLink tool, and if I go over and see this AI assistant, we have an assistant that's trained on all of our available documentation. So if I were to ask this thing, for example, what does the UI toggle do? Oops. What does the UI toggle do? Then it's going to search through all of our documentation and provide you a response. It will also then link you out to the relevant available documentation in our help center. So this can be quite a useful feature to kind of get you started and answer some of those questions that maybe weren't covered in this introduction, or if you just need a reminder. Additionally, there's a help dropdown up here. This contains release notes, again, that assistant that we mentioned before, links out to some of our more detailed tutorial videos, as well as our community forum where we sort of have discussions around different features, and there's some sort of level 2 content and stuff like that. So just want to make sure that those are available for you to use as you begin your WorkLink Create authoring journey. And with that, thank you so much, and best of luck authoring in WorkLink Create.